The radio in Julian's 1974 Land Rover didn't just play static. It played a rhythmic, wet crunching sound, like heavy boots marching through fresh slop. He adjusted the dial, his long, pallid fingers trembling against the cold plastic knob. Each micro-adjustment only shifted the frequency of the crunch, never the texture. Outside, the landscape of the Scottish Highlands was being aggressively swallowed by a predatory fog, thick, gray, and carrying the overwhelming scent of ancient brine and rotted kelp. It was a fog that didn't just obscure vision. It felt like a physical weight pressing against the glass. Julian was a sound engineer, a man who navigated the world not through sight, but through frequencies. He possessed an almost pathological sensitivity to acoustic spaces. He could tell the dimensions of a room by the decay of a single hand clap. He had been hired by Ethelgard Dynamics, a private research firm with a non-existent public profile. Their mandate had been triple his usual rate, and the brief was cryptic to the point of absurdity. Blackmouth Bay. Acoustic anomalies detected. Record the silence. If the silence speaks, leave. Under no circumstances attempt to decipher the transmissions. He pulled into a small, unstable gravel turnout overlooking the Atlantic. The view was panoramic horror. The water below was not blue or green. It was a swirling, opaque black, churning with unnatural violence against jagged basalt cliffs that looked like the broken, rotted teeth of a buried giant. There were no gulls here, no nesting puffins. The sky was an empty, bruised violet. The only constant was the low-frequency, gut-churning thud of the waves and that horrific, digital wet crunching sound still emanating from his dashboard, a sound that seemed to be counting something. Julian, driven by a blend of professional arrogance and a creeping, icy dread, set up his primary recording array. He placed a high-gain parabolic microphone on a tripod on the passenger seat, pointing it out the cracked window towards the bay. He queued up his Swiss-made Nagra reel-to-reel recorder, watching the thick magnetic tape thread through the delicate capstans. He slid on his professional-grade headphones, isolating his world. He clicked the monitor switch. At first, there was the comforting, expected profile of maritime ambience. The broad-spectrum white noise of the wind, the percussive impact of the ocean. He adjusted the gain, boosting the signal to hear the nuances of the environment. Then, a layer of the sound seemed to peel back, like skin from a muscle. Beneath the wind, he heard footsteps, distinct, rhythmic, heavy. Not on gravel, not on grass, but the unmistakable sound of bare, calloused feet slapping against wet, mossy stone. Slap, squelch, slap, squelch. The footsteps were moving from left to right across the cliff face, hundreds of feet below him. They were too loud, too clear, as if they were occurring right next to the Land Rover. Julian pulled a small notepad from his pocket, his hand shaking. 1432. First anomaly. Bipedal footsteps on stone. Impossible proximity. Signal strength high. Hello, Julian whispered into the cabin, a futile gesture against the crushing isolation. The footsteps stopped instantly. The parabolic mic picked up a sound that made the hair on Julian's arms stand vertically. The sharp, wet sound of someone drawing a sudden breath, followed by the low-frequency vibration of humming. It was a mournful, cyclopean melody. It didn't sound like music. It sounded like a mechanism, a cyclical pattern that bypassed his ears and resonated directly in his teeth and sinuses. He looked up from his equipment, his eyes scanning the fog-shrouded cliff. A figure was standing at the precise edge of the precipice, not 50 yards away. It was a woman unusually tall, wearing a bright, synthetic yellow raincoat that looked obscene against the monochromatic gray. Her back was to him, her hood was up, and her body was perfectly, unnaturally still, unaffected by the gale-force winds that should have been whipping her clothes. "Excuse me," Julian called out, rolling down his window fully. The wind rushed in, tasting of copper and decay. "It's dangerous there." The woman didn't turn. The humming in his headphones spiked. The parabolic mic began to feed back, a shriek that felt like a drill entering his skull. Julian watched in detached horror as a network of thin, hairline cracks spiderwebbed across his windshield, radiating outward from a single point directly in his line of sight. He ripped the headphones off, his ears ringing with a painful tinnitus. He gasped, blinking against the sudden silence of the cabin. When he looked back at the cliff, the woman in the yellow raincoat was gone. Not walked away, not fallen. She had just been erased by the fog, as if she were a projection that had been unplugged. He checked his Nagra recorder. The VU meters were buried in the red, pinned against the peg. He hit stop, rewound the thick tape for 5 seconds, and pressed playback through the Land Rover's cabin speakers. "Help me count the teeth, Julian," a voice whispered from the speakers. It wasn't the woman's humming. It was a man's voice, deep, gravelly, distorted by a heavy layer of digital artifacting, sounding as if it were being spoken through a throat full of sand and sea glass. "1 for the tide, 2 for the bone, 3 for the house that sits alone." Julian felt a profound chemical dread coat his tongue. He hadn't shared his name with Ethelgard. His driver's license was locked in a safe box in Glasgow. The firm had only communicated through encrypted, anonymous email servers. He grabbed the laminated map they had provided. It was sparse, showing only the winding coastal road and a single, isolated structure 3 miles further north, perched on a precarious peninsula known as the Witch's Finger. The structure was marked simply as the Grey Gables. The drive was a logistical nightmare of blind, hair-raising turns. The fog was now so thick it reflected his high beams, creating a wall of impenetrable white. He drove by kinetic memory, following the faint, gravelly crunch of the road and the increasing, sub-bass rumble of the Atlantic. The Land Rover groaned, its suspension protesting the uneven terrain. The wet crunching sound on the radio had stopped, replaced by a low-frequency pulse, like a massive, subterranean heart beating one strike every 10 seconds. Thump, thump, thump. The Grey Gables materialized through the mist like a concrete tomb. It wasn't a house. It was a brutalist fortress, a massive linear block of raw, form-pressed concrete, windowless on 3 sides, built directly into the volcanic cliff face. It looked down into a natural, dark sea cave, whose mouth looked suspiciously like a screaming throat. The structure had been an acoustic research station in the late 1960s, a joint project between the University of Edinburgh and the Ministry of Defense. It was abandoned in 1968 after a catastrophic pressure incident that had been conveniently classified. The concrete was stained with black streaks of mineral runoff, looking like tears. Julian located the key under the loose, kelp-covered flagstone indicated in his brief. The metal key felt heavy and impossibly cold, its surface etched with micro-corrosion. He turned it in the massive iron lock. The door opened with a slow, grinding shriek that set every nerve ending in Julian's body on fire. The interior was a tomb. The air was frigid, thick with the scent of ozone, stagnant seawater, and an undercurrent of something metallic, like old pennies or dried blood. His flashlight beam struggled against the gloom, revealing walls lined with rotted acoustic foam and defunct, rusted electronic panels. In the center of the massive circular main research hall stood a horrifying apparatus. A circular array of dozens of massive industrial speakers, all angled inward, pointing at a single bolted-down steel chair in the exact center of the room. A thick bundle of cables, looking like severed veins, snake across the concrete floor to a massive, analog mixing console against the far wall. Julian approached the console, his footsteps echoing like gunshots in the perfect acoustic seal of the room. Dust lay thick on everything, yet he felt a strange, magnetic pull, an acoustic pressure against his eardrums that suggested the system wasn't entirely dead. On the desk, next to a 1960s-era oscilloscope, was a leather-bound logbook. The pages were brittle, smelling of dust and mold. The last entry, in frantic, scratching handwriting, was dated November 12, 1968. The frequency is achieved, 7.83 Hertz. The resonance of the Earth, amplified by the natural geometry of the sea cave below us. It's not just a sound, it's a bridge. We are no longer recording the ocean or the wind. We are recording the things that live inside the sound, the things that speak in the static. They are waiting. They are hungry for a listener. They need a host to amplify their final counting. Julian's fingers, acting with a will of their own, reached for the massive industrial-grade power switch. It was an act of professional suicide, but the magnetic pull was absolute. He flicked the switch. The massive diesel generators, deep in the cliff face, coughed to life with a rumble that shook the entire structure. The speaker array hummed, a sound that started as a low, almost imperceptible vibration, but rapidly climbed in pitch and intensity. Suddenly, the circular hall was flooded with a sound that shattered Julian's concept of reality. It was a cacophony of thousands of voices, all whispering at once, yet perfectly synchronized. It was a tidal wave of overlapping, intimate confessions, screams of absolute terror, and bursts of maniacal laughter. The sound was so physically powerful that Julian found he couldn't stand. His equilibrium vanished. He was forced to his knees, his vision blurring, his stomach churning. From the deepest shadows of the circular room, figures began to manifest. They were silhouettes made not of light or shadow, but of pure visual static, flickering, gray and white forms that blurred in and out of focus like a television tuned to a dead channel. They moved with jerky, stop-motion-like kinetics, their outlines bleeding into the air. They were closing the circle around him. The woman in the yellow raincoat was there. She stepped forward from the static group, and Julian saw that she had no human face. Only a jagged, raw, vertical slit running from her forehead to her chin. A mouth that vibrated with the man's gravelly voice from the tape. "You're late for the census, Julian." The slit vibrated, producing a sound that Julian felt in the marrow of his bones. The voices of the thousands dropped into silence, leaving only the woman's amplified vibration. The inventory is incomplete. The bay is hungry for a precise count. We need a new frequency, a new loop. She reached out a hand made of rotted gray smoke and pixelated static. Her fingers brushed his chest, right over his heart. Julian gasps, his entire body convulsing. He felt his heartbeat synchronize perfectly with the sub-bass thumping from the ground. One strike every 10 seconds. Thump, thump, thump. The Brutalist station wasn't a recorder. He realized in a final, crystal-clear moment of panic. The entire geometry of the sea cave and the speaker array was designed as a colossal transducer. It didn't capture sound. It converted matter into sound. The previous researchers hadn't been killed. They had been digitized, dissolved into an immortal loop of high-frequency audio data, forever trapped within the very concrete walls of the structure. "One for the tide," the woman whispered, the vibration scaling upward, a pure sine wave that bypassed his biological defenses. Julian looked down at his own hands. They were blurring, turning into a shimmering, shifting field of gray and white pixels. He tried to scream, to assert his existence, but the sound that left his throat was not human. It was a perfect, crystalline, 60 Hz sine wave, amplified by the speaker array into a roar that shook dust from the ceiling. He was no longer Julian. He was a waveform, a variable in a mathematical equation. 2 for the bone. The static figures chanted, their voices a synchronized digital distortion. The room began to spin. The brutalist concrete walls dissolved into a swirling vortex of white noise and binary code. Julian could see the Atlantic Ocean outside, but it wasn't water. It was a roiling, infinite expanse of gray and black data. A million lost frequencies screaming in a language of binary logic and existential dread. He saw the figures of the other researchers, digitized and preserved, caught in endless loops of their final moments. 3 for the house that sits alone. The final frequency, a pure, harmonic chord that felt like absolute zero, hit him. Julian felt his consciousness, his history, his very ego shatter into a billion discrete data points. He was no longer the sound engineer. He was the sound. He was the wet crunch in the radio. He was the humming in the fog. He was the echo in the sea cave. The next morning, the predatory fog lifted, revealing a day of brutal, clear sunlight. A representative from Ethelgard Dynamics, a man in a sharp, tailored gray suit, carrying an expensive leather briefcase, drove up the coastal road. He found Julian's Land Rover idling at the turnout, the door hanging open. On the passenger seat, the parabolic microphone lay uselessly on its side. The Swiss Nagra reel-to-reel recorder was still spinning, the thick magnetic tape playing in an endless loop. The Ethelgard man calmly walked to the car, reached in, and picked up the professional headphones. He placed them on his ears. There was no voice this time, no weeping, no screaming, just the sound of a single, slow, deep human breath, repeated over and over, its timing synchronized with the impact of the waves below. Inhale, impact, exhale, and then, layered just beneath the breath, a new sound manifested. The rhythmic, precise sound of a pen scratching against paper. The man smiled, a tight, professional smile. He leaned into the cabin and looked at the dashboard. A fresh entry had been handwritten in Julian's unmistakable, sloping engineer's script on the notepad. 1748. Final entry. The frequency is absolute. We have achieved parity. Perfect symmetry. Blackmouth Bay is finally counted. Do not send another engineer. Send an auditor. The silence is getting crowded. The Ethelgard Dynamics representative closed the Land Rover's door, locking it with the spare key. He placed the headphones and the notebook into his briefcase. He walked to the edge of the cliff, looking down into the churning black water of the bay. He made a complex, synchronized hand gesture, as if signaling someone or something deep within the water. "Good work, Julian," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to harmonize with the ocean. "We'll send the auditor next month." In the distance, on the precarious peninsula of the Witch's Finger, a single structure stood alone. In its main hall, the speaker array was silent, but the concrete itself was vibrating, a sub-audible hum that told a story of counting, of debt, and of the horrifying, endless loop of Blackmouth Bay. The frequency was perfect, and it was waiting for its next listener.